Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Russell Doolittle. So Russ is one of the founding members of our department. He's been here since 1964, and he's been a pioneer in many different ways. So he's been a pioneer in protein structural biology as well as bioinformatics. So he first applied the use of computers for studying sequences, protein sequences, and evolution back in the 1960s. And this is when computers were just first starting out. He went to computer scientists, asked them, can you help me with analyzing protein sequences, protein structure? And they weren't familiar with biochemistry, so he just learned how to program computers himself. So he learned Fortran. He worked with Professor Jack Kite to come up with the Kite-Doolittle hydropathy plot. And that's used to predict protein structure from amino acid sequences. And he also was one of the first to study molecular evolution of proteins. And he found sequence homology, first to find sequence homology between different proteins from different organisms. He's won numerous awards. He is also a member of the prestigious National Academy of Sciences. He officially retired a while ago, but he's been very active since. So he's continued to do experiments, publish papers. He's also been very active in teaching. So he teaches the protein structure component of Chem 209 even now. So he just recently shut his lab down last year. So this is actually his true retirement. And in talking with Russ, I learned a lot about the early history of our department and learned that it has a very rich background that I was not aware of. And it's possible a lot of people in our department are not aware of this history, so that led to this talk. So let's welcome Russ.
So while we're waiting about the lighting, I would correct one thing that Nav said, and maybe others that should be corrected, but I'll try to make clear that I was not a founding member of the Department of Chemistry. I'm going to tell you about the founding members, who were in fact an unusual lot. And it did come about because Nav had kindly asked me to give a lecture into the graduate course a couple of times. And you don't lecture on protein structure without mentioning Linus Pauling. And in passing, I had noted that Linus Pauling was a member of this department. It turned out that Nav had been a fan of Linus Pauling since he was a kid. And so this led to bringing a part of this is going to be a chapter about Linus Pauling's experience here. There are a couple of things I'm going to try to make that I may not get all the way through here. This is a one-off, and budgeting the time is going to be tricky. But the first thing is, this is only the early history, and hence the name. It's before the name of this department changed to chemistry and biochemistry. It's going to deal with the real founders, and it will, in fact, because of their philosophy, go and have a few things to say about other departments, including biology. I see Lorraine back there, and the School of Medicine. We're going to talk about things like the Bonner Plan, which was put in place, and where it went. So it's not all Linus Pauling, it's not all Harold Urey, but a lot of interesting people, and I'll flick through. Oh, and I will beg your tolerance. I put together this PowerPoint thing, and they're not always in the right order, and there are probably misspellings and all that. Just forgive them, it's not that important. Okay, I had actually begun to put this all down on paper long before, when the department was having some growth pains as opposed to growing pains. They had grown too big. And I think that people so often take these things personally when in fact it's outside pressures that can bring about problems. And I'm going to talk a little bit at the beginning about But the first 10 years when things were really good, there were a lot of funding. And then the second 10 years, especially when Ronald Reagan was elected governor and took aim not only at UC in general, but UCSD in particular, and mention a little gossip about that as we go by. Okay, well, everybody here knows that Roger Revelle was the driving force for getting a branch of the University of California here. SIO had been a part of the University of California since the early 1900s, or in that area. But Roger really knew that you really could have a great university here. He had two kinds of people to convince. One were the regents, one of whom really had it in for him and didn't like him. And then there were the people who ran San Diego. And what they wanted, the people in San Diego, some of them, was something like MIT that would do for San Diego what MIT did for Route 128, bring lots of business in and so on. What they weren't interested in at all were the social sciences. Please keep those troublemakers out. But that isn't the way history sometimes works, and the troublemakers actually got involved here. I know some of them well, and it had to do with the Linus Pauling affair also. So how do you go about recruiting a faculty for a new branch? Supposing somebody came in and said, hey, here's your budget, go out and start a department of chemistry. What are you going to do? You know, just what will you go for? So everybody thinks they know how this happened, and Roger Revelle went around the country offering things to all the stars. It said that the pay of faculty in the country went up by 20% as a result of this, because he was going around promising them they could have sunshine and everything, and they would have to raise their salaries. There was something to it. We'll have a couple of notices of that. In 1957 also, Sputnik went up. October 1957. I don't know how many of you here went up on top of your apartment houses and stood in awe as this thing went by, but it was a miracle at the time that it was happening. Well, with that, the NSF became very much more generous than it had been. Congress came through, and so it was the first 10 years are going to be good. They're going to be equipment. You need some more commitment? Come on, send it over. Okay, all right. There was something else that was very important. There was a federal law the federal law came later. There was a tradition at the time, especially among what I'll call the Ivies, the Yales and Harvards and those guys, and the University of Chicago, and it was a rule, hidebound, that at 65 you got out. And on the other hand, in California, for example, different way, overage appointments, you got regent approval. If you were a big enough shot, like Harold Urey, for example, you can come no matter what age you want, doesn't matter. But Revelle realized, of course, you can go out there and hire all these guys cheap. I mean, Harvard sent all sorts of people to Texas and coming out here. A. Baird Hastings was a famous biochemistry at Harvard Medical School, and he came out to Scripps Clinic, which was really a clinic at the time, and set a lot of things in motion here about biochemistry, and like he ended up at the Scripps Research Institute. This business about needing regent approval is going to be a big issue later when we get to Linus Pauling. Okay. So here are some early appointments. They were appointed before there was a department. And in fact, the most important one, it turns out, was Hans Suess. Jack and I were talking last week about Hans Suess, one of the most appreciated of the chemistry faculty. He did remarkable things. And he had passed through the University of Chicago, we'll see in a moment. But among other things, in an early paper with Roger Revelle, Hans did this work. He pointed out that the amount of CO2 in the oceans was increasing vastly, and it would lead to eventually to global warming. I mean, we're talking about over 60 years ago, before other people were plotting these things, but it's right there in a paper they wrote. He also was the one who straightened out the C14 curve. There was always an anomaly. The anthropologists didn't like the way the kings and queens of Egypt were coming out, and Hans went out and got these bristlecone pines that are thousands of years old, cut them into rings, and straightened out the curve. And with that, all the kings and queens came back into the right place and everybody was happy. So he had also worked on nuclear folding. He had done the same thing that Maria Mayer was later going to get the Nobel Prize for, independently, but he was always very gracious and they were good friends. But he worked on that sort of stuff. He was a remarkable person. He also, remember when he was here, his lab was up on top of Mount Soledad, so you didn't see him very often unless you had some real pressing thing. This is the now. In 1956, there was another very important paper. All you have to know is the title, but it's Seuss and Urey. It's the abundance of the elements, and it's showing why there are more evens than there are odds and how they go up and down and so on. But my key point here is that Seuss is now already here, and in this, it says down the bottom here that his address is Scripps Institution of Oceanography, but Harold is still back in Chicago, and there's no doubt at all that Hans is the one that tipped Roger Revelle that Harold was going to be 65, and of course he's going to have to get out. So, in fact, it happened, and so here come the early appointments. Almost all of them are going to be over-age guys at that time. Roger Revelle recruits Harold Urey. Now, Harold Urey, who could have come any place out here or in any one of the branches, he was made a university professor, he really didn't want to run a department. I mean, we'll say a few things about Harold later. Cliff told me a wonderful story about him earlier in the day, but there are thousands. And he didn't really want to get in here and start recruiting people and doing all that. He said, why don't you get Jim Arnold, who had been my great guy back at Chicago. Jim had now gone out back, where did he go? Anyway, he went back east for a short while. Anyway, he came, bring Jim out here as chair. Jim is not only bright, but he can organize, he gets along with people. I'm an old crank, bring him in here. And Jim came immediately. Okay, so they started the department officially 1960. And there were 3 members, all right? They were, in fact now, Arnold? Oh, Jim Arnold, Hans Seuss, and Harold Urey. I was looking at 1961, they got a bunch of other guys in, 2 of them as assistant professors. All right, so Joe Mayer is obviously the husband of Maria Mayer, who's going to win the Nobel Prize 2 years down the line. Martin Kamen, we're going to say a lot about Martin and where he was at the time. Stanley was hired as an assistant professor, even though he had already done a postdoc and was an assistant professor at Columbia. He wasn't happy there. He called up Harold. Harold said, okay, come on out here. Ted Traylor, similar thing, hired as an assistant professor. I mean, these days, it would be outrageous to hire these guys. Joe Kraut came as an associate professor. He was now doing protein crystallography, a new thing, boy, and that's those days. Joe had already been to Cambridge, England, and learned all this stuff that was going on there. And he was a grab at this time. And with that, if he was going to be associate professor, they made Stanley and Ted that. So here you have all these guys, no assistant professors. The good news is no students either. So, okay. So you can have graduate students there, but no undergraduates showing up here until C in 1964. So no teaching. And everybody's happy about this. Now we're going to look 1963. We're going to have a change here. And now we're going to get into pictorials. All right. Okay. Well, no, in 1963, Bob Fahey, who's sitting here today, and Gordon Goals. Gordon is left long ago, went to Oregon, came. He was also, many of these people were in what you might call, Bob was organic chemistry, but Gordon was in meteorite chemistry and things of this sort. So a lot of these people came from what you might call the cosmo realm or the earth science realm. And even Martin, of course, is famous for C14, and a lot of these people are using C14, as I've already mentioned, Hans Seuss, but Jim Arnold, all those people were big on C14. That's how they went after Martin. Here are the pictures. So this is the department in 1963. There are 11 people here. 10 of them are dead. Okay, Bob is the only one alive who's here. Now this picture brings me to a major point that I was hoping to make about this history. Times change, and you can't do anything about history. It's there. And this picture shows the way the world was, not necessarily the way it should have been. But if you were taking one of these memory tests or analytical things, and you were asked what do all these people have in common, I'm sure if you have two X chromosomes, you know immediately what the story is about this. What you might not know, well, there are two other things that are not immediately obvious. I don't know what happened to this. I'm being intruded upon by somebody has said that I'm going to try just hitting the red dot and see if it works now, but somebody didn't like what I was saying there. Okay, well, here's something else. There were 6 full professors here, and they were all members of the National Academy. Now, that's not quite true. Hans didn't get in until 2 years later, but around that middle of the 60s, the chemistry department was always bragging about all their professors were in fact members of the National Academy. There's something else that they had in common besides that chromosomal business. All of these had passed through the University of Chicago. I mean, this was not only an all-boys club, it was a telephone club where you went and got all these people that knew each other. There was there were certainly no ads out there in the New York Times saying we're looking for professors or associate professors for a new branch of the University of California. They used their telephone and bring in these people, and that was the way they were starting. Now, as in all of history, there's a stretch here, and it isn't quite true that there were no women in the Department of Chemistry in 1965, the way things work. And it's, once again, history and anomaly. Here is, in fact, oh, it's so impossible. I don't know if you can read that. In the front row, can you let that, see the name that's circled there, Mark? What is it? Margaret Burbage. So Margaret Burbage, for those of you who don't know, was a famous astronomer, worked with her husband, Geoffrey Burbage. Margaret, for a while, was the equivalent of the Astronomer Royal in England, but they didn't make her the Astronomer Royal, and in fact she left and came back here. But anyway, the reason she's here is that the university had a rule in those days that a husband and wife could not be in the same department. And so this is why, in fact, we have now Joe Mayer. Physics had Maria Mayer. Well, physics got Geoffrey Burbage, and we got Margaret Burbage. But you notice she's marked faculty absent. And I have all these notes from those days, all those minutes, and she's always absent. So in fact, the next day, next slide here, this is in the LA Times in a 1980s article where they're talking about how universities grow in pirate and so on. And I have to try to read what it said, but Margaret is being quoted here, and she said, Dr. Urey made it clear that I was expected to attend the faculty meetings of the physics and not the chemistry department. And then, in pure times of the way the newspapers were, here's this famous astronomer says, recalled Mrs. Burbage. Okay, that's not professor, she was, of course. Anyway, we have more of this slide also. Now I'm going to, in the next little bit of this, talk about curriculum matters. I see Margaret's missing from this one also. Then down the bottom is a plot that Jim Arnold took and brought to the department, and this is actually into its 2nd year, describing the curriculum for all undergraduates in the first college, the first college later to become Revelle. And so, if I get this right here, science sequence for all students. And what it's going to begin with in the fall quarter is math. Every student is going to take math all through the first year. And the point was that it's all going to be, they're going to be solid calculus based, and so no chemistry, physics, or biology in the first quarter. Physics would come in for the 2nd and 3rd quarters and be teaching physics. No chemistry, so. Actually, the chemistry was going to start and in the 4th quarter and split in the middle, so the physics would hand over, when getting out of the nucleus of the atom, hand it over to the chemist. Then there would be more chemistry. No biology until the 6th quarter. And interestingly, I mean, this was by design. This was a committee, and I'm going to show you in a moment, of a biologist, chemist, and a physicist putting this all together. And in the last quarter, they were using the first just available edition of Watson's Molecular Biology of the Gene. It had just come out, and it was by design that they were setting this all up for what every student will know when they came out of here. It was what Joe Kraut called the new humanities. Okay, so these are the people who were setting this up. From chemistry, Jim was the primary designer of all this. David Bonner, that I'll talk a little about. Just point out that David died in May 1964, and he never really got to see this, what happened to his plan. I'm not going to tell you all about his plan, which was a broad thing. And it had tremendous influence on the start. I'll have a comment if I get to it at the very end about the demise of the Bonner plan. Okay, anyway, they wanted everybody. This was really pretty good. The first undergraduates arrived in September of '64, just after David died. And it's interesting, there were only about 180 of them, and the dorms, which are right over here, weren't quite ready. And most of them ended up in apartment houses down there in Pottery Canyon for a month or two until the dorms were open here. Anyway, not many students in the fall of 1964. That wonderful curriculum that those guys designed, you see, idealistically, it was the one they wished they had had, forgiving themselves that they were geniuses and all that sort of thing. But they wanted the average person to be able to do all this stuff. All right, so the science sequence was rather demanding. It did lead to the first watermelon drop, June 1965. Very famous thing that there are people who joined the department 3 years later who say they remember the first one. I don't know, that has to do with memory and aging. But anyway, the first one was where they actually went up and dropped it based on a problem that was on a final devised by Bob Swanson in physics, asking if you went up on top of building B, which it was at the time, I'll show you the road map, and dropped a watermelon, how far would it splat given the following and so forth. Anyway, so the enterprising students, in fact, tried to do that. Now, besides this, oh, and I should point out one other thing while we're there. The unfortunate thing in that June 1965 is that not quite half of the students flunked the physics. I mean, flat out flunked. So that led to, in fact, Jim Arnold making the great adaptation of revising how everything was going to go, math, physics, chemistry, and chemistry was forced to take up and begin, because most of the kids came in having had high school chemistry, they had a head start on that, so they could handle chemistry and they would get the physics later. So the idealism was already leaking at that point greatly. Right? All right, now there were some other very idealistic things. They had these 3 prohibitions. There were going to be no professional athletics. I mean, we weren't going to join anything. Every year, of course, we know the students have voted on this for all those 60 years. ROTC, if those of you who don't remember, that's something about Reserve Officer Training Corps, and it wasn't an academic subject. There was a war beginning to go on, and going to lead to a lot of trouble. And so there were no real uniforms on campus. Occasionally, guys would go down to San Diego State and join and come up and march around the plaza here, and no fraternities or sorority. So this was the recommendation. Now, of course, you understand that they didn't want fraternities or sororities. They pointed out they were almost always ethnic and exclusive, and it wasn't proper. And of course, they couldn't do it. It was against the law. And so naturally, fraternities and sororities did come. And there are, obviously, I've just mentioned. But the athletic one was really interesting because the point they were making, Jim Arnold was really big on this, said that we don't want voyeurs, we want participators. We want people who will go out and do things. And it worked. During the first 2 or 3 years, the percentage of undergraduates at UCSD participating in intramurals, no credit, was greater than any campus on the University of Cotton, any of the others. Even the faculty in those days, I should tell you, I had a phone call one night from Shelley Schultz, physics, and he said, "You want to play on the basketball team this year?" Faculty team. And I said, "Oh, when are the games?" Because they have a game. He said, "Sundays at 11. And I said, "Oh, Shelley, I like to hang around in my pajamas on Sunday morning and read the New York Times." He said, "Oh, no, 11 at night." This is, all the courts were full, you see, all the time. There was the gym here, and that was how they had to schedule them. It was really pretty good, I think, about that. And now, many people don't know that even without scholarships, we had a football team for a while. I don't know if all of you knew that. 66 to 68. I don't know what to say about this, except, well, the last game was a thriller. They lost to Caltech by only 1 point, broke Caltech's 5-year losing streak. I mean, that's just pretty good. I mean, what more can you ask of enterprise? Now, the late 1960s were, in fact, turbulent times. You all know that. The campus, we had our share of turbulence. Here's a clipping. I still own this newspaper from the San Diego Union, 1965. And it's really just pointing out how bad we are up here at the university. Bunch of commies. I own this, and in the article that I was written, when I was writing this whole thing up, that it's worth reading the whole thing, how bad it was. So I ought to tell you about the incident, about what's described in this article. What happened is that a bunch of graduate students, 2 faculty, there were also among them 3 women, it points out, and 2 of the men had beards. There were at least 3 that weren't born in this country, or maybe 2. And what they had done is they had picketed Building B, protesting the United States military being involved in, I think it was San Salvador, where they were doing the bid of the dictator there. And it took about 15 minutes. And then they got on the little microbus that went down to SIO every 20 minutes and so on, and they marched around the building there for 15 minutes, and then all in good spirit, nothing. But it led to this article, which was unfortunately very the feeling of the community around. This was a very conservative area in worst possible ways. People who rented houses or sold them, real estate agents had color-coded cards with ethnicity and things of this sort. Jonas Salk was the first Jew ever to be allowed ever be a member of the Beach and Tennis Club. I mean, this is we're talking about ancient history here. Still, you don't believe that? It's true. Anyway. All right, so we had a chancellor, Bill McGill, who later went on to become the president of Columbia, and he was a good guy, and he got a book out of all this called The Year of the Monkey, and this is about UCSD's revolt on campus. And you see people in here, some of you are going to recognize Angela Davis here, and there's the Gov, okay, Governor Reagan. Now I'm going to say a few politically incorrect things about the governor. To remind you, you think we're on hard times right now, there were other hard times. The first move that Ronald Reagan made when he became elected was to fire the president of the University of California, Clark Kerr. You're out, he said, that's it. I mean, he's one of these power-mad people, that think they can do everything. Out he goes. There was a year when the legislature was so much against it that state employees were all given a raise except the faculty of the University of California. They were singled out. UCSD, they had a committee sent down here to look over cost savings, and after their visit they came back and said, we're going to sell the rare book collection. Why? It's hardly being read, only by a few scholars. Well, there was a big protest. Okay, and okay, we won't. It's the usual override. So they said they won't sell it. Instead, we'll just close the library evenings. I mean, it was one of those outrageous times when things were tough. All right, another interesting thing. You may know we have often had business about people worrying about how many in-state students were taken compared with out-of-state students. Well, Ronald Reagan was the one who raised and had the outrageous tuition for out-of-state students. He wanted it because he said, we've got to keep out those troublemakers from New York. I mean, that was a quote in all the newspapers. So later, of course, the university is glad to have the bucks, but it was Reagan who started all that. Here is a protest, 1968, when the regents met here in the gym. This is in McGill's book, is where it came from. And they're waiting for the regents and the governor to arrive over behind the gym on a foggy morning. Now, this was a very moving time, I thought. I don't know if any else of you were there. I was there. I don't know about Bob or Joe, but not Charlie? Oh, this was, there was a wonderful time because what they did, instead of coming there with furious signs and, banging things and so forth, this crowd, which for a small university in 1968 was numbered up into the thousands, that is maybe 1,500 estimates were, stood there, they got there early and didn't say a word. It was silence, absolute silence through the entire thing. We remember the governor's car drove up and he had his door open and said, well, what's going on here? Not a word, no derisiveness. They stood there through the whole meeting and they didn't disappear until all of them had gone. It was really effective, showing how unanimous the feeling was against what Reagan and his tyranny against the university. Okay. Now, I see minutes here. I see Peg Griffin signing this one. Peg was the department secretary. Oh, it starts up at the top. Linus Pauling. Dr. Mayer said that Dr. Pauling is not only willing, but desirous of coming here to La Jolla. Okay, so that's what this starts with. There's a letter. And this secretary sent a memo out to the chemistry department. Okay, so how did this come about? Well, Linus Pauling. Let me just see if my next PowerPoint thing is here. No. Okay, Linus Pauling. Well, everybody knows Linus Pauling, the world's greatest chemist and all that and so forth. 2 prizes, Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1954, Nobel Prize in Peace in 1962. He was an undergraduate up in Oregon, and later became Oregon State, and then went as a graduate student to Caltech, and after a short period as a Guggenheim Fellow in Europe, came back all the way Caltech. However, in 1962, after he won the Nobel Peace Prize, and the reason he won it, of course, he had taken up the business of testing, A-bomb testing above ground, and pointed out how dangerous this was, what it was going to, how many people were going to get cancer from all this, and strontium-90 showing up in milk and so forth. And so he was so good at it that he joined up with the Santa Barbara Center for Study of Democratic Institutions at Santa Barbara. And they would put out papers and so forth and try to be, maybe try to get maybe a 3rd prize, who knows. But anyway, while he was there, he was also getting on in age. And he was thinking that, boy, he didn't want to retire as some kind of social scientist. He was a real scientist. And so he thought, well, I'll go back to Caltech. Now, the next is scuttlebutt. I don't know this for a fact, but I have it on very authoritative sources I'll tell you about in a moment. Okay, he called up Caltech. I'd like to come back. And Caltech hemmed and hawed and said, you can't come back. Our board of trustees would be outraged. We'd lose all our benefits. You can't come back. I mean, this is astonishing. So Linus, who is imperturbable, called up Stanford. Hem, haw, well, we have a board of trustees. So he had been rebuffed by 2 places. Now this came to light because Maria Mayer had invited Pauling to come down from Santa Barbara to give a seminar here. And although it was in the physics department, given it's a small place, and given that he's such a big shot, the place was just jammed. Go and hear Linus Pauling. And it was clear that he was up there at Santa Barbara, but he was still thinking. And he gave a seminar on nuclear folding and things, really right with it. And so before that seminar was over, the chairs of biology, chemistry, and physics huddled in the hallway and said, and the story had been passed that he couldn't go back to Caltech. They said, offer him a job. And in fact, they offered him a job. And in fact, he came. So, but it was not so easy because it wasn't easy to get it. He was a controversial figure. And we had our share already. At any rate, he came here and was on the faculty from 1967 to 69. I'll jump ahead a little bit and just tell you that he's going to do some serious science while he's here, or more or less. And when Stanford saw that, and thanks to a lobby by some of their eminent members, Stanford said, well, we didn't realize you were serious. If you come up here, we can give you a 5-year appointment. And in fact, he went up to Stanford, and then while he was there, he started an institute. We won't get distracted there. All right, so this is Linus Pauling. I own this book, and I actually watched him sign this. I mean, it looks like it was embossed with the printer, because he has signed probably 1 million signatures in his life. It took him about 3 nanoseconds, not a stamp that came out. And a remarkable man. His office was right up next door to Joe, up on the top of the physics building, I think, on the 5th floor. Joe, you were right down the hall according to the phone book. All right, nature of the chemical bond. I was going to say some words about how Nob got a hold of this, but I'm going to go by. So here is the department in 1968. All right, so there's Linus Pauling. And our other Nobel laureate on the top, Harold, back up, Harold Urey. There's Dorian Gray in the middle there. I don't see, there's Charlie up there next to, behind Linus. Okay, so he really was here, and he was serious. He wrote these 2 papers while he was here, and both obviously very diverse. One on orthomolecular psychiatry. You know, well, a lot of people don't put much stock in this paper, but it's a very highly cited paper. It's starting out on individualized medicine. But he also wrote one here on superconductivity. All these are given with the chemistry department and as a mailing address and so forth. He also had a lab in Bonner Hall. He had a technician working hard there, Sue Oxley. And he also had an admirer there, a graduate student from the chemistry department who was, right after getting his PhD in chemistry, was given a job in biology as an assistant professor, and who had gone to Caltech as an undergraduate and was just wooed by Linus Pauling and went off with him. He was Art Robinson. And I don't know, Bob has some thoughts about Art Robinson. This is a story worth one on its own. Art Robinson is a climate denier, among other things. Anyway, I knew Art very, very well, and it's interesting how people change or don't change and so on. Okay, well, one of the most famous papers that Linus Pauling ever wrote, it was the experiments done while Linus was in Europe, but 2 of his co-authors ended up here at UCSD. John Singer from biology, Harvey Atano came later. And there's a wonderful paper about this, though, and I put it out here for good reason. I'm going to immerse now into the Bonner Plan. The Bonner Plan, well known to biologists and chemists here of old, had to do with David Bonner's thoughts on how education is done. David had come here from the Yale School of Medicine. He was a PhD, but one of the things he really wanted, I have a slide coming about this, was to keep the School of Medicine fully integrated into the main campus. He didn't want to be like Harvard, where they have a river in between to keep them from interacting, everything. He wanted them to stay really cerebral. And so it turns out they gave appointments in those days from the general campus to the medical school. Chemistry department got a couple, biology got more, SIO got one, economics, math, all appointments that were given to the medical school. All right, so in fact, when they cobbled together an appointment for Pauling, they had to go to those chem meds and biology meds because FTEs were still very hard to get. So officially, here's this great chemist, he's got at least 1/3 of his pay coming from the medical school. Well, when did the medical students come? I hope I have this right here. And the charter class arrived in September 1968, 47 students, okay? They were supposed to have 48, number 48 was a no-show, okay? So, what are they going to do? They give them white coats, and their very first class, boy, that censor is really after me here. Out you go. That very first class, they get them out of their white coats, they go down to University Hospital, which is where medicine was in those days, and they sit in an auditorium, and they have a class called Introduction to Clinical Medicine. Okay, they met on Saturday mornings. The topic, sickle cell anemia, Pauling. Can you imagine how many medical students in this country, the first lecture they got was by Linus Pauling? Only here. I assure you it never happened anyplace else. But it was a mark of Bonner really wanted this sort of thing. He wanted to keep them. Now, there were all sorts of reasons that were going to go against him later. Oh, wow, what is this supposed to be here? Well, this says now, in that part that's underlined, Bruno points out now about the problem of Linus Pauling already being known to the local community as being a problem. And he is in that age where you need regental approval to have your appointment renewed. All right, that's what it says here. I'll just try and read it. Bruno, Bob Fahey taking notes here. I don't know where Peg was. Bruno, that Pauling's appointment can be continued only by approval by the regents. It was moved and seconded and so forth that the chairman should prepare and forward the papers to get the appointment going as soon as possible. The motion passed unanimously. However, there was a problem about these appointments. Nobody ever noticed these appointments. When it was Harold Urey, they didn't care if he was over 70 or whatever, and so on, but they worried about this. Now here are some faculty meeting. We have a new chair. Kurt Schuler is brought in as chairman of the department. Bruno hated being chair. Oh boy, he didn't do anything. Anyway, they announced in the department that the appointment of Linus Pauling was reaffirmed. They thought they were going to have it now. All right, well, here is the problem. Birth dates and ages, June 1968. As I say, Harold Urey, as long as he's going to be around, he's going to be here. Linus Pauling, he's going to be 67 in this time of decision. And then after that comes the rest of those early founders. And I went by the name of Herbert Marcuse. Now, many of you here, young people, probably don't know who Herbert Marcuse was, but he was really a kind old man. I lived down the street from him for a while, and but he was an avowed Marxist. And I mean, not only that, he was a loud avowed Marxist, always making speeches. The BFW, or no, the American Legion, and this is all described in McGill's book that I showed earlier, American Legion tried to buy up his contract. Get rid of them. Here's the money for his tuition. Anyway, there's also a lot of correspondence between Marcuse and Harold Urey. Anyway, but Linus Pauling says, well, look, they're getting rid of Marcuse. He's going to have to stop. And I'm only 2 years behind him. What are they going to do to me? And so he's thinking, I'm going to have to get out of here. Now, at the time, this is written up very well in McGill's book. McGill tried to get the rule changed so you didn't need to go to the regents. You only needed the approval of the chancellor. And it worked to a degree, but by this time it was too late. Pauling had that dangle from Stanford, and he was going to be out of here and on his way. Now, eventually there became, just to put this in the record, a national law that people like the Harvards and Yales couldn't throw out the faculty at 65. They had all sorts of exemptions around, but it obviously changed the character of universities and departments when you had all these old fogies hanging around. I won't go into it, but there's more to be written about that. Okay, well now we're just going a little bit further in here about the early part and the number of faculty and changing how departments accrue and get people. And you can see they started off at a rapid rate. They had to do it with all those Chicago people. And then they eventually got to a steady state. And from after the time that Harold died, there were others. Joe Mayer is not going to be long behind. A lot of those founders are going to disappear from the scene. It reminded me, though, that I wanted to say a few words about Harold as we went by, his picture earlier and so on. Yeah, Harold, there are, I guess, three things I'd like to say out of the many that could be said. If you wanted to do a word or a hyphenated word to describe Harold, I would say it would be straight-laced. He didn't smile a lot. I mean, back in that picture I showed, 1968 was a typical Harold Urey. But down underneath, he was a teddy bear. He, every day, brought his lunch in a brown bag, or maybe something in a brown bag, and went over to the coffee hut and had his lunch. And he would talk with everybody and anybody. And you could be an undergraduate and sit down next to him, and he'd have something to chat about. He had views on everything. He didn't like noise. He found several memos complaining about the air conditioning in what became Urey Hall, Building B. And they designed it all wrong, he told them. He went on to how they could have been better. He once explained to a group of us at lunch about highway noise. We were worried about all the traffic, and he pointed out it wasn't the engines that caused the noise, it was the tires on the concrete that were the noisy thing. There ought to be a way to take care of that. At any rate, here's a generous story I want to tell you that occurred when he, just after he died in 1981. He had won the Nobel Prize in 1935, I think, but it was for work, the discovery of the neutron, essentially, in 1934. And nobody, I had never heard this before, but he had written a 3-author paper for the paper that won the prize. 2 junior faculty and himself. And clearly, he was the authority and did it all and so forth. And nobody, the other 2 were forgotten people. Well, one of them came to a memorial we had in 1981 later in the year for Harold, and the other had already died. And the guy gave a very moving thing about what a different person Harold was, and I'll tell you why it really was moving. When Harold went to Stockholm and came back in 1935, without fanfare, or without telling anybody else, gave each of the other 2 guys 1/3 of the money. The collective gasp at the memorial showed that this was not common practice, but that was the kind of person he was. He was really. His wife, and of course this is not only Urey Hall, it's the Harold in anyway, Frida in Urey Hall, was just the opposite. She was a charmer, ran newcomers, everybody visiting all the time and so on. And Harold used to say, well, I lose a lot of friends because I talk too much, but Frida makes friends faster than I lose them, and so the kinetics are okay. So, the Bonner plan, watching the time. I don't like guys who go past 5 o'clock. All right, now David Bonner. His 2 thoughts, the 2 big premises. First, he was what was called the universities where you had big tents. He didn't like balkanization, these are terms. He thinks that, now this is a worrisome thing. There were people who would feel differently. I think that I had read that if you want to have a cooperative group and things for a department, that the ideal size was down around 20, where you could all get together as we did back when there were only fewer than 20 people in the faculty. Back in that era in the mid-60s, in the early 70s, we would meet in one of the conference rooms in what is now Mayer Hall, and people would bring their brown bag lunches to this, and we could all have a voice and speak to each other. And of course they were at different levels. It had gotten to be now, because the students were here, they had to have a lot of assistant professors in the room. And I'll just tell you about, just a little aside, boy, I have to stop and think of it. I didn't plan to tell you this, but I hope I get this right. I better not. All right. Anyway, the reason I'm hesitating is because I'm not coming up with his name, but maybe if I tell him, Charlie will tell you his name. Anyway, the rule about having to get out of the Ivy League was still in play. And Joe Mayer came to the group one day and said, hey, we've got a great chance to bag somebody. He's going, not only that, he's going to win the Nobel Prize this year. He had it on good authority. And said we could get him. And the assistant professors didn't know much about this guy, of course. But then the word got around to them that, yes, he was a great scientist, but his course back at Yale was known as Norwegian 1-2. And who was he? Oh, Lars Onsager, right. And in fact, Lars Onsager had to go off to Florida. He was obviously looking to get out of that cold New Haven borough, but we could have gotten him. And Joe Mayer couldn't, we had secret ballot. And Joe Mayer couldn't believe that by a vote of something like 8-7, we had turned down Lars Onsager. But we knew the teaching was all going to fall on our end over there. All right, well, anyway, in spite of this, David Bonner felt you had big departments taking in all disciplines so that they could interact. And this was put into play, for example, in what is now Bonner Hall, which was Building D back in 1965. The labs and offices were alternated between chemistry and biology. They wanted them to speak together. John Singer and Martin Kamen shared the secretary between their big lab. I'm thinking about Bruno was next to Mel, not Mel Simon, but Mel Green, but they had alternated them so that they would continue to interact. And of course, there was a lot of occasionally tension. They used the same cold rooms and eventually got to the point where somebody would, I'd hear in the cold room, I thought that was biology centrifuge. And you knew that it's beginning to decay a little bit here along the way. All right, but the School of Medicine, and I'll tell you a source where you can read all the gossip about this at the end of the talk when I get there in a minute or two, was to try and keep, once again, everything interacted. I actually was a member of the bylaws committee of the School of Medicine, along with an economist, Seymour Harris from Brandeis, and the dean, Joe Stokes III. We wrote them up one afternoon. This is what we think it ought to be. They had no idea what a School of Medicine should be or anything like that. But anyway, he put all people on the committees, was what you're supposed to end up having done. Okay, he wanted to keep the things here. There were all these appointments made. Now, this was now going to be a guide to things. I'll just tell you about how this worked. At the time, the people in surgery and medicine, they had full-time equivalents like the general campus. Higher rate, but they didn't have to go out and get any money from patients or hospitals or anything like that. The problem was now the university hospital had a lot of empty beds since they didn't have to take care of patients anymore. So they began changing the formula X, Y, Z and so on. And pretty soon there were stitches and saw fewer and fewer of them. It was disappearing. But in the meantime, the medical students were here. Biology and chemistry were supposed to be responsible for the first year. And then gradually the clinical departments would take over for second year. They would have surgeons taught anatomy instead of a PhD anatomy. It was pretty good for a while, but you could see it couldn't last. It was too idealistic. Expansion has its own gas release. Well, I won't even go through the roadmap of all these buildings changing their names and so on. I have to see, issues. Oh, wow. All right, I'm only going to spend a few minutes. I promised Uli I won't go past 5 o'clock, and I don't like guys who go past 5 o'clock. Issues. The big issue really had to do with the formation of the Department of Biochemistry. Martin Kamen was the original biochemist in the Department of Chemistry. He came here from Brandeis, where he had gone with Nate Kaplan to start a real Department of Biochemistry, a graduate course of biochemistry at Brandeis University. And remarkable about how outside forces can get involved here. So Martin desperately missed California. He had been out here, got the Berkeley at the Rad Lab and all that before then. And so he was glad to come when Jim Arnold made that famous call. But he went to Nate and said, Nate, why don't you come with me? We got just a chance to really get out there. But Nate said, no, I'm happy here. No, he came out and visited, but no, because they had a wonderful deal. The Rosenthal Foundation had given them 10 years of money, a tremendously lavish budget to make a wonderful place at Brandeis. 10 years later, however, something happened in world affairs, and it was the Six-Day War. And Rosenthal took all the money and gave it to the forces on the side he was interested in. And Nate suddenly found he was broke. Holy cow. He called, out he came, all right. But with him, of course, he wants a real Department of Biochemistry, and Martin is with him. So it led to 20 years of effort before it was going to become chemistry and biochemistry as a kind of compromise here. There are letters in the minutes about all this. There were good arguments, common interest, equipment, places getting too big. I think that was the business about the geography, about the different buildings we were being spread all around. Those at the School of Medicine would certainly favor having a separate department of their own over there. I was going to talk a little bit about Bruno Zim, who was, this also in biochemistry. The original plan was biochemists who were more physically inclined and mathematical would be in chemistry, which Bruno certainly was, and others who did more softer biochemistry would be in biology. That was going to be the plan. However, there is but one chemistry. This was back when they were worried about whether organic chemistry was going to be a real chemistry. May I tell one more little story here? Physical chemistry, cosmochemistry. What about biochemistry? Now, biochemistry takes it on the chop sometime, but they had somebody that could get even me be more of a problem. This is Erwin Shawgraf, who was a bitter guy. He defined molecular biology, practice of biochemistry without a license. Well, this is the way it was degenerating into here. This is a little off the cuff what I want to tell you because I just thought of it as going through all this stuff. I had a friend back in those days when everybody in the department would be naming their friends. And so the big top guys would be naming people like Lon Zarsager, and the assistant professor would be naming things like their roommates from Berkeley, okay, and Lee Clark was Bob Fahey's roommate and so on. And so at any rate, I had a guy that I really thought would be a wonderful protein chemistry here, and I don't think he'd mind me using his name, but anyway, he had one problem, and that was that he was an MD, but he had gone off and postdoced with real protein chemists and done some wonderful work. He worked on fibronectin, and anyway, he had a slight speech stammer. I had that as a part of this also. At any rate, at the time, Kurt Schuler had just come here as a chair, and we were walking over to the basic science building where this guy was going to give his seminar. And Kurt had been worrying about these appointments, and in more than one occasion had said, but is it really chemistry? Okay, because he was worried about these biochemists doing all this soft stuff. And so I thought, this guy was doing real chemistry. He later went on to be a very distinguished chemist at University of Wisconsin. At any rate, we were walking to the seminar and with Kurt, and Kurt said, well, I see you're an MD. And he said it ferociously. And the guy said, yeah. He had a little stammer. And Kurt said, but of course you must have majored in chemistry as an undergraduate. And the guy, philosophy. I knew we were sunk. But he was really a very good biochemist and had a very distinguished career. And those who might want to know his name, I can tell you sometime. All right, now Nate, just in the last minute or two, when Nate came, he was no doubt about his influence on the department and the School of Medicine. He came from Brandeis. He had an immediate influence on hiring a whole bunch of people because of the chem med growing. All of these people came as a result of Nate's urging. He had known Ed Dennis's postdoc advisor well and had gotten a very good recommendation, and Nate was the one who suggested Ed for the coming here. And of course, Susan came with him as a postdoc. So this happened a lot. I was going to tell you, this is not unusual. There were a bunch of us who were walk-ons who didn't get recruited from some other planet. It was easy, no travel expenses, and they seemed to have made out okay. But most of them biochemists, I would add. Okay, well, here, just a wind-up time. 1981. Well, you notice there are at least 2 women here. We're gaining. And haven't made it all the way yet, though. There's a lot more to be done. There's Charlie with his necktie. Okay. All right. 1982, growing a little bit. There's Susan's not here in the picture, but I see Gita Vold up there in the second row. The department's getting bigger and bigger. there were the chairs, and the main thing about this is that in 1995, the name of the department is going to change to chemistry and biochemistry. My thing that I was writing was only going to go through the Department of Chemistry and won't go beyond that. And there was a reason that this happened, or it contributed. Something happened. This is the count in the department up to 1995. And there's going to be something coming with those arrows. All right, the first arrow was that in what were called VERIP. Now, VERIP, if you don't know the nomenclature, stands for Very Early Retirement Incentive Plan. Okay, and there were 3 of them. And the first one came about around 1989, and it was because, once again, politics was involved. This time it was Governor Pete Wilson. He had tried to raid the university pension plan to pay for regular, ordinary university expenses. And he was rebuffed by the courts. And so they had to get rid of expensive professors, and they introduced the retirement plan, which was to tweak the formula. The formula had how long you'd been a professor or whatever, how old you were, and things of that sort, what was your highest rate of pay. So what it did is they changed the formula to make it look as though you're older than you really are, and all that sort of stuff. And so the first time they did this, hardly anybody took it. A few overburdened math teachers who were teaching all the time and so on. But chemists were living a good life. Nobody was going to go for that. So they went up a little bit more the next year. It was sort of like playing blackjack, you know. How high will they go? So they came back one more time with this one, VERIP 3, and they said, this is the end. Not going to be any more after that. And with that, 9 people from chemistry went for it. Boom. That was VERIP 3. Decline. Now, it doesn't go down quite by 9 because a couple of people were hired, but it was a big, big change. All sorts of people just suddenly disappeared. Not a great deal because they didn't really disappear. All they did, they disappeared from teaching undergraduates. They still kept space. It was not a good deal for the department, I have to tell you, even though I was a beneficiary. They made up a new title. Nobody wanted to be Emeritus because it sounded like an old guy with a cane. So they made up a sort of research professor, and then people with that, they all stayed and it was everything. Okay, well, then the department name changed. I'm going to end it here and just tell you that if you want to get some facts about some of this stuff that are more verifiable and so on, there was a book written about this time, Nancy Scott Anderson, and it really, I've read through this recently now, does justice to why the Bonner Plan failed, I think. From different point of view here and there, but not altogether bad. Anyway, you've been very patient, and that's the end of this story. You can go. You don't have to ask questions, and okay, go ahead.
Or we could volunteer additional notes, nominate champions. For the greatest faculty intramural player of all time, I nominate Jack Kite.
Jack Kite, right. I do remember, in fact,
defensive end in co-ed football.
Carol Post was recently
Yes.
the head of the Protein Society, and she was on the team. She was a Bruno Zim graduate student, and so Jack and that what a team. Carol, she was a quarterback, I think, throwing. She was passing. Anyway, we did have a good football team. Basketball wasn't so great, but football.
Pretty good in softball too.
Okay.
I love basketball.
Okay, well, look, you don't have to ask questions after these things. There's going to be a reception. I would tell you that if Cliff Kubiak, did you come, Cliff? Oh, Cliff, right in front. Do you want to tell them the story you told about Harold Urey?
Since you gave such an excellent seminar, I might not.
Anticlimactic.
I'd be willing to.
Will you?
Yeah, I apologize to all of you.
No, please do. I enjoyed it
When I
greatly.
first got here, I was so lacking in details of the history of this department that I used to frequently ask Jim Arnold if he would go to lunch with me and tell me some stories. And so we used to go to lunch every couple of months, and he'd tell a lot of stories. And I said, can you tell me some stories about Harold Urey? I mean, he's such a prominent figure in the department. He said, well, Cliff, I'll tell you one and you'll understand a lot of the other stories. I said, well, okay, tell me the story. He said, well, there was this PChem seminar, and it was just dreadful. It was so bad, everyone was sitting on their hands. They were so embarrassed that the speaker had done such a poor job. And the seminar chair didn't have the presence of mind to have thought of a question himself. And so there was this long, anxious period where silence was all that was in the room. And the seminar speaker standing there. And finally, Harold Urey, who was sort of in the rear of the room, put his hand up. The seminar chair was just absolutely delighted that the most famous person in the room was going to ask the question. So Harold got up out of his chair and he looked around and he said, somebody here give me a ride to Del Mar.
Okay, good enough. Let everybody go.